It's become more trendy. Classical liberals like Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad, Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, Kraut and T, and others are getting accused of being right-wingers, extremists, Nazis, or conservatives by progressive left-wing bloggers and self-styled journalists. I have a theory or a thought that might help explain how these classical liberals get labeled as right-wingers. This thought may not be unique to me, and I may not be the first person saying it. I've never heard anyone put it quite like this, and I hope it's useful to someone. To answer this question, let's use an object lesson with one of my favorites, Dave Rubin. Imagine politics as a spectrum on a football field. The 50-yard line is dead center. On the far left goal line are the radical progressive leftists. On the far right goal line are staunch traditional conservatives. This is slightly oversimplified, but this is to illustrate the overall greater point, so bear with me. 20 or 25 years ago, Dave Rubin would have been on the 25-yard line on the left. Maybe I would have been on the 25-yard line on the right. Conventional wisdom says that if Dave and I are ever on the same side of the field, it's because one of us moved, because one of us changed stances. But what happens if you move a goalpost? What happens if you move the left one, say, another 400 yards, and then redraw the center line? Suddenly, Dave Rubin and I are on the quote-unquote right side of the line with a lot of other classical liberals. We didn't move, the line moved. If you move the goalpost another 400 yards, it's about half a mile away from its original spot. Suddenly, classical liberals and conservatives find that they have a lot more in common than they have different, and their political enemies are fairly distant ideologically. So who and what is the progressivism and the progressives seen at the left goalpost? Sargon called these radical leftists, quote, progressives recently in this video, thereby differentiating them from liberals. Jordan Peterson and Stephen Hicks link the progressive left with postmodernism and cultural Marxism. Elements of the progressive movement are groups such as social justice warriors, third or fourth wave feminists, Antifa socialists, players of identity politics, Black Lives Matter, Tumblerinas, and so on. These are elements of the progressive movement, though no single one of them embodies the movement as a whole. Progressivism or progressive liberalism is an expansionist movement. By nature and by definition, it has to grow. It has to progress. Its progression is utterly necessary for its identity. It's expansionist for expansion's sake. Progressivism is ultimately infatuated with the bleeding edge, the point where the fire line meets the tinder, and so on. It's very consuming, colonial, or even imperial almost, like a wildfire growing to the left. Progressivism is about the next cultural evolutionary leap, the next step, and the next firewall to challenge. Conversely, conservatism is the adherence and preservation of traditional norms, values, and ideals. It is focused on the past, on the morals, philosophies, and laws that have made society great thus far. Anyone championing traditional values today is usually in the conservative camp and generally owns their position with pride. Think of Dennis Prager, Alan West, or Ben Shapiro. But how do progressives and progressivism as a whole move the left goalpost? Well, here's one example with Dave again. Dave is a married gay man. Now, homosexuality was highly taboo in the 1960s, and publicly being gay was almost unheard of as it was considered a mental disorder. Take a look at the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee for an example of how gays were officially persecuted by the state. It was ugly. Being gay was a very closeted liberal idea, a very edgy, pushing the envelope kind of idea. By the 1980s, however, just 20 years later, being gay was much more normalized, as publicly seen in Elton John and Freddie Mercury, and it was thus less edgy and more mainstream. In 2015, gay marriage was legalized in the United States, and in a way, that's when it went fully mainstream. Being mainstream is not really cutting edge. So what's cutting edge sexually today? Gender fluidity, gender plurality, 47 genders, pushing to lower the age of consent for sex, outright advocating for pedophilia, or at least advocating for discussing pedophilia, concepts of revoking consent and crying rape after consensual sex, changing the definition of rape, rape culture concepts, and so on. Being gay was once culturally cutting edge sexually, but now Dave Rubin is just another white, married, reasonably successful American male. That identity alone should give you an idea of how progressives view Dave and his stance of classical liberalism. This illustration of homosexuality shows how the left goalpost has moved. But why does only the left goalpost move? Why doesn't the right goalpost move also? Well, the right does shift a little, and you can see this as conservatives embrace gay firebrands like Milo Yiannopoulos or Camille Paglia. The right does loosen up from time to time. Conversely, the alt-right is trying to drag the goalpost back to the past when America was theoretically more of a white nation, though modern conservatives, such as myself, generally see this as backwards and regressive. But the identity of the right is not to progress, but to preserve. Conservatives are by definition not goalpost movers. They might shift and embrace new ideas, but their nature is not to push boundaries like a progressive. The nature of progressivism is to move lines. The temptation is the easy write-off of saying, yeah, Dave or Sargon or any liberal has gotten way more conservative, when in reality, it's the lines that have shifted. It's not Dave that moved, it's the standard by which he was called a liberal that shifted under him. This is how Dave and others like him are called conservatives. They are generally conservative compared to progressives, though not necessarily compared to conservatives in general. So the lines keep moving. Progressives want to stay progressive. They want to keep pushing the boundaries of the norm. If one is going to be progressive, one has to have a place to progress to. Radical progressivism will always need something new, some new territory to capture or an idea to embrace. Therein lies the problem. Whatever progressives have is only enough for the moment. It cannot stay enough. If it becomes an established cultural norm, a traditional value, a legal status, it by nature sooner or later becomes an old value, a conservative value, at least as far as a radical progressive leftist is concerned. Ultimately, though, the issue with progressives is that their current shtick of identity and victim politics, as spurred on by concepts of cultural Marxism and intersectionality, means that their growth is in finding new identities, new victims, and new abusers. If they can't find naturally occurring identities, victims, or abusers, then they will create them. This has resulted in a witch hunt against classical liberals and conservatives alike, and it's also resulted in a crusade against reason and dialogue. As I finished this video, I had one final thought. It never fails. I compared progressivism to a fire, and I think there's a point here. When progressives set a fire 50, 25, or even 10 years ago for a cause, I have no doubt that some had limits as to how far they'd take it. They wanted, say, gay rights, but they never wanted to have people screaming "cis scum" at bystanders. Others want to stay progressive. They want it to be part of their identity, and they'll push it as far as society lets them, or even further. Progressivism as a movement likely has people that cycle in and out of it, and it also has some permanent lifetime members. The point, though, is that while the group of progressives might morph and evolve, refresh or recycle, the progressive fire itself keeps burning. I think in some cases this fire maybe got away from some progressives, like Brett Weinstein, the Evergreen College professor, now in hiding, as he's threatened by this same fire that he helped to foster. What this has resulted in is a rather odd alliance of gays, conservatives, classical liberals, atheists, libertarians, and the religious right, and we're concerned that this fire is getting beyond the point of all control, even for the progressives. This fire is raging in our society, and we are concerned about what it has consumed, what it is now consuming, and what it will consume.